feeds you. I'll be waiting.
Howdy campers, and welcome back to your favorite podcast, That Would Be Rad, the podcast that majors in 80s and 90s nostalgia, comic culture, all things paranormal, and minors in retro video games, tabletop RPGs, pre-internet mysteries, and raising our kids to be half as cool as we were back in the 80s. I'm your counselor, Tyler Bentz, and this is your other camp counselor,
Woody Brown.
Hey, pal.
Hey, man.
Whoop. Whoop.
How goes it, man?
Pretty good, man. Pretty good. Feeling pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Got my getting my yard aerated today, so
Oh man, big time stuff.
better late than never.
Yeah, I mean it's been so hot here in Georgia, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be any relief. Although here lately, it's been kind of weird, where it's like the mornings are in the 60s, and then the afternoons are just mid 90s, which is
Yeah.
I mean that 30-degree difference is boy, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean, I do have to say that this is the first year that I can think of that, like, my grass is just getting obliterated.
Yeah, me too,
From
man.
the heat.
Yeah.
You getting, like, dead spots and stuff?
I mean, a little bit. I mean, I have a irrigation system. So rich. But we're not here for turf management, folks. We're going to be talking about, it's like, this isn't really the apex of all that is spooky that we've talked about yet. But we are starting to dive into these accounts that, you know, first we talked about the Shadow Man.
Mm-hmm.
Then you can't talk about Shadow Man without talking about sleep paralysis.
That's true.
What's interesting is when you talk about both of them and you kind of just mash them all together, you start to hear about this other entity that's prevalent throughout a lot of these events, and that's none other than the Hat Man.
Yeah, I would say the Hat Man is kind of like the star student or the MVP of, like, you know, when you get into the specifics of, like, the Shadow Man, basically.
Yeah, it is interesting, though, because as we'll see, it's sort of like what we talked about last week. You can have a Shadow Man encounter and it not necessarily be a Hat Man encounter.
Mm-hmm.
But what we'll see as we go through this is that more and more people kind of have this recognition of this figure that, well, let's just dive in.
Yeah.
Okay, imagine, listeners, Tyler, imagine that you're alone in a room. It's dark, it's late at night, you know, just maybe the gentle sound of a ticking clock in the background. It just kind of seems to stretch on forever.
But by the way, real quick, not to interrupt, but do you know anybody that is, like, really annoyed by the sound of, like, a clock or, like, a watch?
You mean like in the middle of the night? I mean,
Well,
I kind of am.
Are you really?
Yeah.
I mean, I have, like, that old Timex, and if I put it in my, like, bedroom, like, the drawer on my side of the bed, like, my wife will be like, get that thing out of here. And I can't even hear it. It's, like, so low, but, like, there's something about that pattern that just drives her bonkers.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. It just depends. Like, unlike you, my watches and stuff, I can't even notice them anymore.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're going deaf.
Yeah. But, you know, like, there's that moment in the night where everything just seems to be super still. And, again, it's kind of different for us here, especially down south, when it's the summertime and you've got all these crazy bugs making so much racket outside. But you know what I mean? Like, there's those moments when things just get super still. Mm-hmm. And whenever you awaken to that stillness, and there's nothing else but those maybe annoying clock sounds, the ticking. And then on top of that, all of a sudden you start to feel this presence, this unsettling feeling like you're being watched. You look around, there's nobody there. And a lot of the times, this is the beginning of how people report the early stages of their encounters with the Hat Man.
Mm-hmm.
He's this shadowy figure, seen sometimes in the dark corners of rooms, tall silhouette with distinctive wide-brimmed hat. Kind of like we said, this is unlike the other shadow figures. And not just because he's wearing a hat, but in comparison to those that we've kind of talked about, these events, just a regular sort of shadow or silhouette in the middle of the room, or even sleep paralysis, this time when the Hat Man's involved, his presence is much more pronounced and, menacing.
Yeah, that is the one characteristic about the Hat Man that, he definitely still shares that sort of observer trait, of his like shadow man brother. But there is one thing that's like pretty common throughout all of the stories of the Hat Man is like he typically is, I don't know, it's like he's sort of leaning in a little more to things that would naturally cause like us to be afraid or sort of instill like fear in us.
Right, exactly. And I think the skeptics of the world, if they were sort of met with this scenario in the middle of the night, the first thing that they're going to think of is like, oh man, there's somebody here to rob me or something, right?
Right.
But it's so much more than this. And what's crazy is that since, truly ancient times, humanity in general have really just kind of been haunted by shadows of any kind.
Oh, yeah.
And stories of shadowy figures kind of date back all the way to like, you can find them in prehistoric cave paintings, medieval texts. And among these entities, even back then, the Hat Man stands out. He's different, more defined, more intentional. He's sometimes described as standing over 6 feet tall and again wearing this wide-brimmed hat. His attire kind of varies. Sometimes it's a cloak or even a suit. But the one thing that's always constant, man, is that dang hat. I think, again, not to just keep on pointing out the differences, but I think it is important because we have kind of yet to hear about people being able to interact with the entity that they see. Most of the time it's, oh gosh, they wake up in the middle of the night, they're kind of freaked out, they see it in the corner. With sleep paralysis in general, they just feel that weight, they feel like someone's there, but that's it, right? Among these sort of stories, and unlike those stories, he doesn't just watch from the shadows, he's interacting and sometimes, reportedly, even communicating. But the question, it's just like the thing that keeps on popping in my head is like, what does he want?
Yeah. I think that question can be posed to just the whole Shadow Man phenomena in general is like, what's happening? Is there an element of like, there's, clearly it invokes fear. And I would be hard pressed to think that like they wouldn't be aware of that, And so therefore, like, is it that fear response that they're sort of aiming for specifically in the Hat Man? Is it like, is there some, are they kind of like, it's like the like vampire kind of thing? Are they sort of like feeding off of that kind of fear response, or like what's going on? Because a lot of times, like, and even with mine, it's like they just sort of stand there and it's like they're just sort of soaking up that fear that you're, as young kids especially, you're just freaking out,
Well, let me ask you this. With your own encounter, and I know we're going to kind of bring it back into the mix, not in this episode, but did you feel like you wanted that? Did you want to communicate with it, or were you just kind of too fearful? Like, oh my gosh, I don't even want to hear it speak. Like,
oh yeah. Honestly, like one of the things that really jumped out to me, no pun intended, but one of the things that was so scary is like, obviously I'm a young kid, so I don't think at the time I was really able to grasp like what was really happening, but the sort of creaky doorknob turning, that was scary, but then it kind of like sort of like glided across the room. And I think at that point, typical, like on all these sort of encounters, blacker than black, you know, that sort of age-old kind of thing. It's just this sort of like silhouette that you can see. All that was like, I was immediately terrified just because of that. But when it took it up a notch when I could see it sort of like shifting its body a little bit. Because at that point, it took it from, oh, it's just this sort of ambiguous black silhouette in my room that's sort of this two-dimensional kind of thing. And now it's like, oh, this thing has like, it's conscious, it has like sentience where it's aware enough of its surrounding, and there's like enough of like a I don't know, what would you say, like physicality? So like, if a person's like, dead still, like standing there, you're still going to see like tiny little minute like movements, like shift its weight or kind of like, lift like a shoulder slightly. Like it was doing like that kind of stuff, which immediately made me twice as scared.
Yeah, because then that gives it a sort of more sort of realistic. It's less sort of like, oh, it's just my imagination. And more like those are actual physical body movements,
right? Right. And at that time too, like I would have assumed that this was a ghost because that's all we kind of knew back then. And so even back then, I remember I was like fascinated with ghosts, but there was this idea that like, oh well, ghosts are kind of like, you didn't really know like, oh well, did they know that they're alive? Is it just sort of this replaying like specter kind of thing? And so when it did that, like when it, it kind of started like the shifting its body and stuff, it just felt like, oh, this thing is like capable of like physical harm. And no, the answer is absolutely not. I did not want anything to do with communication. I just wanted it to go away. And
so like that's another sort of aspect or characteristic, I should say, that a lot of people report with the Hat Man is this sort of like feeling of impending doom.
Yeah.
I think in other cases and stuff we've talked about where people see it, they're afraid, but then this sense of calmness comes across. So far, from what I've read, this is not the case with the Hat Man. It's almost always this impending feeling of doom, and even like looking at its sort of featureless eyes, there's almost this like weight behind this like stare, like it wants something. That on again coupled with the sleep paralysis is really kind of where it starts to crank up the terror factor.
Yeah, one thing that I thought about when doing the research into this is like I did run across several stories which I thought this was interesting because this almost sort of contrasts or goes against the more like sleep paralysis type scenarios where in several of these like Hat Man encounters or shadow people encounters, they talk about like it's almost like the Oz effect where all the sound like goes away. It's like you hear that a lot with like Bigfoot, and like I said, the Oz effect is where say you're walking in the forest and you get this feeling of impending doom, but then all the animals just like go dead silent. You don't hear squirrels or birds or anything. The wind dies down, and some people with these encounters say the same thing, which again is interesting because it contrasts against that the sleep paralysis thing where you're hearing a buzzing or like a humming or like a pulsing type sort of feeling in your brain.
Man,
like an attic fan.
I've experienced something similar to that out hiking on the Appalachian Trail and stuff, but it's that same kind of deal when there's this absence of, it's almost like there's this vacuum that you can sense because of your five senses, I guess. But like that void really kind of like makes you think and wonder and like, whoa, why are things so quiet all of a sudden? No, I mean, similarly, as a parent, your kids are up to no good when things just get so quiet. You're like, wait a minute.
Too quiet, right.
They're up to no good.
That's a good point. Yeah, I've never put those two together, but yeah, maybe it's just that.
Yeah, right. some of the things that people have talked about with this is that this is just one of those hallucinations that people have when they are experiencing sleep paralysis. Now, we talked about that last week. If you didn't hear that episode, you can go back and listen to.
Hear more about this on That Would Be Rad, Season 4, Episode 18, the sleep paralysis episode.
And so we went into the science behind it all. But here's kind of where the debate gets a little interesting here, because if the Hat Man is just a manifestation of our brains during sleep paralysis, then why in the world, dude, do people across cultures and continents and history describe almost to the T nearly the same exact figure?
Yeah.
You know, it calls into question, like, is this some sort of, and we're going to kind of talk about our theories about this later in the show, but is this some sort of universal archetype in our, like, sort of collective subconscious? Is it something more tangible? There's other things that I'm sure it's pretty easy to guess that we can potentially relate this to. I don't know. It's weird, man. I don't know how else to put it. It's just very strange. Rad strangeness, if you will.
Oh, for sure, rad strangeness. Yeah, I think, to me, like, just the, and I don't know Carl Jung personally, but I would go so far to say that, you know, when he's talking about, like, your shadow self and, like, the archetypes and, like, you know, sort of wading in that area of, like, psychology and you know, just sort of the human psyche or whatever, I would venture to say that, yes, like, your shadow self and that sort of side of a person that's, you know, that you want to keep hidden, you know, that maybe indulges in certain things that you would never indulge in, like, you know, if you didn't have any sort of moral compass or whatever. But I think with the shadow people or the shadow man or whatever, I feel like that still, you know, and this is sort of a Joshua Cutchin thing too, which this would be a great topic to discuss with him, but there's a lot of that, like, manifestation stuff. And, you know, is this, like, sort of a form of the sort of dark side of humanity that we're sort of, like, manifesting, you know, in a way. But I feel like where that theory kind of reaches or goes as far as it can go is then you start having, like, the Hat Man character. And to me that, like, takes it to a whole other place. Right. Because now it's like, oh, you're seeing a silhouette of, like, a humanoid type bipedal you know, so it's like a person type entity, if you will. But then, like, oh, now it has a hat on. Like, I know it's, like, such a small detail, but to me it changes all that.
Right. It's almost like no matter what you do, it just starts to, like, overshadow your. But but, like, for real, it, like, overshadows your mind a little bit. And you know, speaking of things that can overshadow your life in general, I gotta say, man, you remember when my productivity used to be haunted by stress and distractions?
Oh God, I love it. I do.
It sounds like I'm joking here, but it did feel like the old Hat Man was just sitting on my shoulders all day long. It all changed. Okay?
Okay.
When I found Magic Mind. Now, before Magic Mind, both of our days, I would say, were a chaotic mess. I mean, no joke, folks. Tyler literally was calling me every day until we got our, like, welcome back shipment in the mail. Like, hey, man, where's the Magic Mind? I was scattered, stressed, couldn't focus on anything. And truthfully, it's like I've banished this Hat Man from my life, and I'm clear-headed, focused, way more productive, man, without the jitters or crashes from too much caffeine.
Yeah, I've got to say, this is the first episode back where I took my Magic Mind shot, and it's hard to explain. I feel like as you get older, you know, we get a little slower. There's, you know, things that once came so easy and you had, like, such a razor sharp, like, recall for things. You know, some of those things now start sort of being on the tip of your tongue and you're like, what was that thing? But I will say, like, in all seriousness, it just bridges that gap between, like, oh man, I can't remember that thing, and being able to remember the thing. So,
I mean, honestly, it truly has become a crucial part of my daily routine. I feel just stranded without it. Here's the best part, folks listening. Campers, you can try it right now. There's a special offer that they have given us, up to 48% off of your first subscription or 20% off one-time purchase with the code that would be rad and then the number 20 at checkout. Just go over to magicmind.com/that would be rad, and again, enter this code that would be rad and then the number 20 at checkout.
I love it. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, man. Highly recommend. Give Magic Mind a try and see how it can transform your day, just like it did for me. All right, man, let's dive into some of these spooky encounters.
This is my favorite part of the whole thing.
I couldn't agree more, man. All right. In our first story, we explore the story of a woman named Lila. As a child, Lila experienced strange incidents in her family's apartment, like a table fan turning on by itself.
A key falling from the sky.
Huh? Yeah. But these events, though startling, were relatively harmless. Her life took a dark turn when her family moved to a new house. Surrounded by property and an adjoining barn, the house initially seemed perfect. But as the seasons changed, so did its energy. After a cheerful summer and autumn, tragedy struck in January. Lila's father had died unexpectedly. This loss, of course, drove a wedge between Lila and her mother, both drowning in grief. Looking for answers, Lila questioned her Christian faith and turned to a distorted version of Satanism. She began to perform rituals, burning her hair in blood. Shortly after, sinister events began to plague her. It began with whispered voices outside her windows at night, an overwhelming fear of the dark, and a sense of being watched while showering. Yikes.
Uh-oh.
One night, while talking on the phone with candles lit, Lila saw two fiery orbs in the window's reflection, hovering above the flames. These orbs suggested that whatever was outside was about 7 feet tall. Inside the house, Lila dreamed of a deceased blonde girl in the attic, and her room's walls would light up with glow-in-the-dark scribbles. She experienced frequent sleep paralysis, but of course the climax of her encounters occurred one night when she heard footsteps in the hallway and sensed someone standing in her room. She presumed it was her mother, or maybe even a pet, but then she saw the silhouette. The tall man wearing a hat. Lila then darted to her mother's room. Only later did Lila learn that when they first moved into the house, her mother had sensed a malevolent energy. Her mom had even invited church members to bless each room. Decades, of course, have passed since her family left the house, yet its haunting memories still linger. She even occasionally dreams about it, each dream a vivid and unnerving recollection of the events that transpired within its walls.
Yeah, I will agree with that. I've had many dreams since my sort of encounter. I mean, I think with any sort of trauma, it's going to find its way in your dreams.
I mean, it's weird, and especially in this specific instance, this is the first time that we've ever sort of, I guess, been able to relate some of her own decision-making into sort of why, or a potential reason why, a Hat Man visit occurred, right? I mean, I don't think we've really dealt with that as of yet. For the most part, people are just like, I have no idea. This is just something that started happening.
Yeah, right. I think for the most part, too, I don't want to say for the most part, because I have seen both, but I think it's probably more so than not sort of these singular encounters with these things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess I've heard of like some people that have like multiples, or usually those I feel like are more associated with like the sleep paralysis side than like the more sort of physical wide awake kind of things. I have a really interesting one, and it's a little difficult. His English isn't the greatest, but this is from Carlos in Venezuela. My name is Carlos. I'm 40 years old. I am from Venezuela, but I live in the USA. I've always had encounters with paranormal entities, so fear is not usually a problem. But last night, I dreamed that I was walking with my partner through a square, and a very tall tree man greeted me. And when I tried to see who it was, he threw himself from the tree and fell to his feet. It was a shadow of a thin and tall man with a hat and a raincoat. I put my partner behind me, and when I tried to face him, the shadow opened his arms and raincoat and began running towards me. He prayed to hug me and place me inside his raincoat while I was paralyzed. I managed to wake up, and when I woke up, I investigated and found all the stories of the Hat Man. If I return to open a meeting with him, I will let you know. It's a little...
Yeah, that's okay. Google
that feels
Translate
more like
I didn't help him out at that time.
Right.
A popular thing that Tyler would say, I don't want to drive away from the dock here, but I do want to say two things. One, something about that story reminds me of, do you remember that story we talked about, I mean, seasons and seasons ago, where this lady felt sort of like these like arms grab her, and almost like a Sigourney Weaver style Ghostbusters 1, like the arm sort of like clamped around her mouth and was like pulling her towards like a bush
like
or
a
something
bush.
like that. And then she somehow escaped and all that. This is exactly what we were talking about earlier, which is what separates the Hat Man encounters from the other stuff. And that is that it is interacting. It's seemingly having more of a purpose than just like observation.
Right,
you know?
right. It's doing more than just sort of like standing there,
right,
like watching.
And then the second thing I was going to say is, for the first time in my life, last week, I was looking for some chapstick. Okay. And I walked up to this nice lady, and I said, that worked at the grocery store that I was in. And I said, excuse me, ma'am, where can I find the chapstick? And she just held up a finger and grabbed her phone. I thought, interesting. I bet they have some sort of app that they can use to locate what aisle it's on.
Oh,
you know?
Yeah.
And then she then says in Spanish, basically, and I could understand it, you speak into this. And I'm like, okay, where can I find the chapstick? Wow. And then she's like, looks at it, and she's like, dude, this is so funny. She understood the where can I find thee, but then from her Samsung Google phone or whatever.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Sorry, I apologize for those that are not iPhone users.
Yeah.
But, hey, you kind of get what you pay for. Anyway, it spelled out the word chapstick as chat-stith. And she's like, what is chat-stith? And I'm like, and I like made the motion like, you put it on your, and she's like, oh, please. And so anyway, I don't know why I told that story other than what you just read kind of reminded me of that.
I love it. I mean, maybe the Hat Man's real name is Chat-Stith.
Yeah. Anyway, it's interesting that there is this this definitive difference between these things. And that's, I think, kind of what we were alluding to in the previous weeks, which is now we're starting to really ramp up the fear here, the fear factor, if you will. And it makes it so much scarier because if you think about it, yes, seeing a shadow in your room is terrifying.
Oh, yeah.
Being paralyzed and not being able to move when you wake up, terrifying.
Yeah.
Now this thing is like trying to grab you or, making you feel like it's going to do something to you. I mean, that's, that is next level, dude.
After these messages, we'll be right back. Hey, this is Bryce Johnson from the Bigfoot Collectors Club, and you're listening to Tyler and Woody on That Would Be Rad, because that is rad.
Well, since we're talking about kind of the next level and more of the, sort of like doing something beyond like just observing, I have a story here that's pretty terrifying.
Okay.
It was about 8 years ago when I first began having strange experiences. Awakenings would be a better word. I began to be very conscious of things I had not seen before, new learnings and understandings. About 2 years after this began, I was sitting in my lounge room. My eyes were closed. I was just relaxing. When I opened them, I saw in front of me not my usual TV cabinet and such, but instead what looked like a transparent pub bar with bar stools and everything. Sitting on one was a very black shadow. So black it made all other black around it look gray. Shaped like a man in an old style hat and coat, he leaned crooked on one elbow, just staring at me. I don't know what he was staring, as he had no face at all, but then I sensed him grin. Still no face, but yet I knew that he was grinning. He slowly raised his hand and tipped his hat. Then it was all gone. The bar, the hat man, only to be left confused and feeling heavy somehow, and terrified. I've seen a lot of weird things, and this was way up there. Was he approving something I'd done? Was he somehow acknowledging me? Is he bad? Is he evil? Or is he here to test us? See if we will submit to doing evil things even? I don't know, but he's real, and I'd love to know more.
Man.
Yeah, dude, the grin. As soon as I read that, I immediately thought of what I was saying before about how, sort of shifting its weight, like doing something that a physical person would do. And, that's creepy.
I mean, on so many levels. Just like you said, the fact that you could feel something making an expression.
Yeah.
And then potentially sort of like taunting one, really. It's not like it's, you don't know what its intention is here. So like something creepily smiling at you, you don't know. It's the same reason why there's a movie even called Smile, because it's like, just because this person is smiling in sort of this inappropriate setting makes it terrifying. And then on top of that, the tip of the hat thing is like, oh, it acknowledges that it sees me and that it knows that I see it.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just, All right.
Yeah. Yeah. I do wonder if, I haven't discovered any where, I don't know, I guess victim, I guess is safe to say.
Okay.
But I haven't found anywhere like the victim was able to kind of go past like the fear response and sort of try to like interact. Like it is, I do think that's maybe why it ties so nicely to sleep paralysis, because there's just so much like fear involved that you're just like afraid to even like move. Like for me, one of the main things I remember is I was just like pouring sweat, like beads of sweat were like pouring from like my hair on my forehead, because like I didn't want to like even like remotely move so that it would know that like, I was maybe able to see it, or I don't really know what the logic was as a kid then, but yeah, it was like full on like my own paralysis just out of the fear.
I mean, yikes. I hope to goodness I never experienced this. All right. The next story that I want to talk about kind of sounds a little bit familiar, and my brother will know exactly what I'm talking about. Because this one takes place in a small rural town surrounded by vast fields of peanut plants. This community is like this small community steeped in local legends. The land even is rumored to be an old Native American burial ground, which even adds that, classic 80s mystique to it. I mean, we all have seen the movie Poltergeist.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one night, a security guard at a peanut harvesting plant would tell these sort of scary stories with his family. Instead of talking about typical night shift challenges, he spoke of this man in black who always wore a flat-brimmed hat. This figure was even known locally as the Man in Black. On one particular night, the storyteller had upset his mother, and she basically sent the kids away to go see their dad at his workplace, along with his siblings. Their mom was furious, and this sort of act of discipline seemed to be rooted in an old tradition of confronting fears, or perhaps a belief in the presence of spirits at night.
Oh, wow.
As they approached the plant, the storyteller, who's still young, was filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. The night was unusually quiet. The kind of silence that makes every sound seem amplified, much like we've talked about.
Yep, right.
Together, the siblings entered this dimly lit plant, shadows kind of stretching across the walls. The father, a stern man who was accustomed to the odd hours of night shifts, greeted them with a mix of surprise and concern. The storyteller and his siblings were left in a small office while their mother spoke in hushed tones with their father. It was in that moment, sitting in the office, that the storyteller first saw him. A shadowy figure, taller than any man he'd ever seen, standing in the doorway. The wide-brimmed hat cast a long shadow across the room. The figure didn't move, but exuded a palpable sense of dread. Terrified, the young storyteller tried to call out to his parents, but his voice felt trapped inside his own throat. The figure remained, watching, waiting. It felt like an eternity before his parents returned, and when they did, the figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. This encounter left a lasting impression on the storyteller. And over the years, he heard similar tales from others in the community. The Hat Man, or Man in Black, seemed to be part of their collective fear, an entity that appeared in moments of intense emotional turmoil.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I do kind of like that idea of, I guess your modern day, a lot of modern day parents would view that as like cruel or whatever, but I don't know, there is something kind of cool about like sending your kids out to kind of confront, their fear. And I like that story. I have one here that is a little bit different, but I find it really interesting. She says, I randomly looked up this topic. One of my great-grandmothers on my mom's side, my mother's mother's mother, would occasionally see a tall, thin man with a beard wearing a stovepipe hat. She stated that his clothing style and personal appearance reminded him of Abraham Lincoln's time period. She would wake up to him standing at the bottom of her bed, pulling on the blanket. My father, on several occasions, also saw what he said was a man in a hat walking through the house or through the yard. He saw this figure at my house one time too. He said the time period looked turn of the century, 19th to 20th. I just randomly Googled people seeing a man in a hat, and not only discovered this is some sort of phenomenon, but an actual mainstay in culture. Thanks and have a great day. It's interesting because I don't know. I feel like they sort of left the detail out of, like, was it, black or dark, or was it just like fully, just as I would see you sitting in a room,
Yeah, man. I don't know. I don't know what to think of it all. You know, I mean, even though I know I've got, I think maybe one or two more, and I'm sure you do too. It's difficult for me not to just go ahead and start asking the questions of all the different possibilities, right? So like you had the one girl who started to experience these things after sort of, I mean, dabbling in some maybe occult stuff. And then you had this, I don't know, a concentrated area, not really a window area, but like this place where that peanut plant and community was, where you know, they had Native American burial grounds and all this. These are like two kind of different reasons as to why these encounters happened. And then yours were completely different as well. Like, what's going on here? Are these demons? Are they ghosts? Are they people, like, I mean, for lack of a better term here, shadows of another dimension? You know, all these questions are kind of coming into my mind. Is it some sort of manifestation of our shared consciousness? You know, like you talked about Carl Jung, and he's, like you said, talked about all these different archetypes, symbols and stuff shared by all of humanity that reside deep within our collective subconscious. I mean,
like the archetypes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, you know, is it within our nature to sort of represent our shared anxieties and fears and histories? I mean,
yeah, like is it somehow tied to like almost like an Akashic record type thing,
right,
where we're just sort of tapping into the same database, you know, and sort of the human collective of like human history or whatever.
Right. And it's weird too, because it's like, is it a part of our, like, even if you were going to get super scientific about it, okay, is it part of our biological instinct to sort of have this fear mechanism that then somehow we end up all sort of having these similar anxieties, and then they manifest as this almost symbol within our shared consciousness? I mean, it's very, and then, okay, here's the thing. These reoccurring appearances across all these different cultures and demographics, and those listening, and if you're a longtime listener, or if you're a brand new listener, I think it's pretty easy to pick up the fact that we love when this stuff happens. We say it all the time. When things have occurred throughout history before, and that's why we always say pre-internet mysteries, you know, right now we live in a time that has this insane, historic, never before has it been like this, for the, I guess, the capability of distribution of information from human to human has never been like this before. So quick, so fast, so broad, you know, through news, social media, even just being able to just like text message someone from across, you know, the globe.
Yeah.
When all this stuff happens before that, you know, you're talking about in cultures where they might not have even seen somebody wearing a wide-brimmed fedora before.
Yeah.
They might not have, I mean, during a time before those hats weren't not only not fashionable, but didn't exist altogether. I mean, I don't know, bro.
Well, it one of the things that I do think about, like, regarding this phenomenon is, I mean, we've all heard this before if we've dabbled in any sort of paranormal, especially like in the earlier days, like growing up in the 80s and 90s. You know, you would have all these like accounts of people seeing, quote unquote, like ghosts or spirits, and it was so common that like anytime you would see, you know, people would see these things, they were always in this sort of like Victorian dress. That was like such a common kind of thing. And so I do wonder if whatever like component is like happening there, you know, as far as like people seeing like these like, you know, old timey, like Victorian-esque ghosts, I wonder if that something is tapping into that in the same way with like this, you know, 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, like fedora. Because they often also say, you know, it kind of looks like a trench coat or like an overcoat. Right. Sometimes they would say that like even like the collar was kind of pulled up. So I don't know.
I mean, some of that kind of gets back into, I think when we talked about time slips and stuff, we kind of, I kind of alluded to this idea that if time travel exists, then there probably are some sort of constraints when using it. And by that, I mean you can only travel to a certain time period or, whatever. And maybe, I don't know. I mean, I even confuse myself whenever I start to think about it, because it's like, I'm not sure why we haven't seen anybody as a shadow man holding an iPhone.
Yeah, that's true. Also, one thing that sort of just piqued my curiosity after I mentioned like the 30s, 40s, 50s, sort of goes along the lines of like Men in Black even. But I just looked it up, and the fedora was actually introduced in the 1890s by a French hat maker. The hat was originally designed for women and named after the title character in Sardou's 1882 play, Fedora, in which the heroine wore a soft-brimmed hat with a crease down the middle. So that's, I don't know, maybe it does go back a little further,
Yeah.
That's interesting. I never knew that until just now. I actually got one that I want to dive into, since we were sort of on the topic of like older stories and stories, pre-internet. And so this says, I was 8 years old, 1988, Bogota, Colombia. I saw him the same way many others have had. I was playing in the living room of my house, and he appeared in the window outside in the patio. He was wearing a big hat and had bright red eyes. He looked at me, and it was an unforgettable terror. I could only scream and run. I know 2 other people who say that they've saw this figure with a hat and red eyes, and they were not sleeping. It's not an apparition from a dream. Pretty interesting.
Yeah,
Colombia.
All around the world here, man.
Yeah.
All right. So this one comes from a lady named Sarah. She had always wanted to share her haunting experience with someone, but, and we've talked about this plenty on the show, she was kind of afraid to share it with people because she didn't want to be met with the skepticism. Mm-hmm. She didn't want to be met with judgment.
Yeah.
But her encounter was so deeply etched into her memory that even after 20 years, just the chilling sensations about what happened remain. When she was around 6 or 7, her family lived in this ancient 200-year-old cottage. And it was sort of nestled in the heart of this dense forest. Her father had chosen this also reminds me of something, dude. Anyway, her father had chosen this isolated place after some personal setbacks, and they had few neighbors due to the remote location. First off, look, I'm all about moving to a rural location and not having neighbors. If it means I got to mess with the shadow man and the hat man and all that, just have a neighbor, okay?
Yeah.
One fateful night, a loud roll of thunder woke her up. She tried to drift back to sleep, but suddenly she noticed almost like a fleeting movement within her periphery. This, of course, sent an icy chill down her spine, and she could feel her hair standing on end. She turned to her left and was immediately paralyzed with fear. Standing before her was a shadowy figure right beside her bed. Appearing as a pitch-black silhouette of a tall, broad man. The dark entity seemed to be draped in a collared cape from, you guessed it, the Victorian era, and crowned with a distinct, wide-brimmed hat. Sarah says that she couldn't discern any facial features whatsoever, but that the shadow's presence was so overwhelming, she felt its gaze directly upon her. Standing there, it sort of swayed subtly, as if it were breathing, which amplified the terror she felt even more, just like your situation, dude.
Whoa, I've never heard somebody else say that. Wow.
Contrary to what some say about sleep paralysis, Sarah actually was able to move, but she was too afraid to.
Mm-hmm.
After what seemed to be like hours, tingling sensations from her motionless feet sort of broke her focus. Eventually, the strain of just trying to stay awake and being afraid wore her out, and she eventually fell asleep.
That's exactly like mine.
The similarities here are kind of striking, honestly. Upon waking up the next morning, there was this wave of relief that washed over her as she prepared to leave the bed.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was this sound of a plastic bag beneath her desk that startled her. Expecting it to be like a mouse, after all, this home was, over 200 years old, she glanced over to witness this bag's handles shoot upwards, as if someone invisible had grabbed it. Terrified, she raced downstairs, skipping over steps and almost falling down. Her father immediately noticed the pale expression and quickly asked her in a joking way if she'd seen a ghost. But little did he know how close he was to the truth. Years later, upon discovering the phenomenon of the Hat Man online, Sarah learned that she wasn't alone in her experience. She also stumbled upon theories suggesting that the shadowy figure often appeared during family crisis. This actually resonated with her deeply because her parents had recently divorced when she'd seen the shadow figure. Even more unsettling was this notion that the Hat Man's appearance often preceded a tragic event, and not long after her experience, her father passed away.
Wow.
We will return after these messages.
It's a pretty cool place if you're a Martian.
Or a vampire. You think you really know what's happening around here, don't you?
Is anyone out there?
We're fighters for truth, justice, and the American way.
Hey, this is Woody.
And this is Tyler, and you're listening to That Would Be Rad.
And now, back to our show.
It sort of feels like the Banshee,
Right.
It's like, and even some reports of like
Mothman.
Yeah.
Yeah, this
Impending
harbinger of doom. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is also the first time that we've kind of talked about any sort of next day interaction.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. I'm blown away at that, and I wish I could reach out and have a conversation with a Sarah person because, man, I've never heard one that was like so similar.
Yeah.
I mean, that's crazy. I have one, and this is my last one, that is somewhat similar, but it maybe even ups the ante as far as the fear factor. I recently discovered that others have also seen the Hat Man phenomenon, and I felt a great sense of relief knowing that my experiences as a child with this entity were not just singular and perhaps a figment of my imagination. Back in the early 1990s, when I was between the ages of 10 and 12, I was asleep on my side with my back to the side of the bed when I felt someone tap on my shoulder, causing me to wake up. As I turned to look, I saw a shadowy figure with a top hat standing over my bed. Alarmed and absolutely filled with fear, I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I continued to scream while the Hat Man started smiling and then laughing at me with a wide grin, resembling the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. Yikes. Eventually, my mom came into my room and turned on the lights, causing the Hat Man to completely disappear. My sister, who was sleeping in the room next to mine, said that my screams were like nothing she had ever heard from me before and thought that I was literally being murdered. The experience was incredibly intense. Since that night, I've had other strange occurrences, but the Hat Man has not reappeared, thankfully. At the time, I was unsure what to make of this experience, as the grin seemed cartoonish, and I could not understand why the entity was wearing a top hat. It made me question whether I had really seen it. However, I knew that I was fully awake and fully terrified, and not in any kind of sleep state. I'm grateful to know now that others have also seen similar things, including the crazy grin.
Yikes, man.
So that's like, so there is like the smiling man, which, you know, that kind of falls into Indrid Cold and some, you know, talking about bringing up Mothman again. That is, or like the grinning man. Yeah, but this is like really scary because I guess it's just completely black, but then she's able to see this big, you know, cartoony, like white teeth smile, which is, I mean, for sure scarier.
Yeah, I mean, it is, but then also I feel like I'm not sure which one would win the, I guess the blue ribbon or the gold medal, since we're getting closer to the Olympics here, on who or what would be scarier. You know, something just staring at you, or also I guess the smile probably.
Yeah,
you know, that's especially in the dark. I mean, that is just
yeah. And also like that idea that, you know, going back to like me hypothesizing at the beginning of the episode, you know, is it like preying on that fear or somehow like soaking up the fear, you know, because it was like when she started screaming, it said that like the grin got bigger and then it just started like laughing, like it was like, I don't know, kind of amping up, you know, like it was happy that like she was, you know, terrified.
Now, if there's a silver lining to all of this, I got to say that in none of the stories that I found, and sounds like in none of the ones that you've found, is there like the next step, which is, other than this just being something that I guess haunts these folks' memories and dreams for like a long time throughout their life, there's no like, oh, this person was, you know, I don't know, hurt, destroyed, killed, you know, something like that.
Yeah.
And I mean, the reason I say that is obviously we briefly talked about this last week as well. A lot of this went on to inspire Wes Craven for the character Freddy Krueger. And if you notice, if you think about the things that we think of when we think of Freddy Krueger, guess what? You got the glove, of course, which doesn't really have anything to do with the Hat Man, but you've also got the hat.
Yeah.
You know? And his silhouette is a really famous one.
Yeah, big time.
And so these are the things that whenever I was a kid, when I accidentally watched A Nightmare on Elm Street too young, I then began to have, I mean, that's the only sort of connection to any of this stuff as far as experiences go. That was the one thing that haunted my dreams for years, dude, was Freddy Krueger.
Yeah, he was like scary to me, but there was something, I don't know, there was something about his, I don't know, because he was so sort of like a little on like the whimsical side, and he was always kind of like cracking jokes and stuff. Like, I don't know, to me it was like obviously scary, but it wasn't scary enough for me like not to have like a poster on my door. It never like scared me in that way. Although I still think that it is he's my all-time favorite like horror character.
For me, it was just that I watched that first one and it took me a long time to dive into the sequels. And so in that first one, he's less of that sort of caricature that he becomes.
Right.
And more just like the concept in general of something being able to get inside of your dreams, hurt you, and then you're also hurt in real life. That's just unescapable. The fact that these kids are trying so hard to stay awake and keep from dreaming because they know that when they do, they're going to be haunted by this entity. That's just terrifying to me.
Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, just like this Sarah lady, I think in some way, again, keep in mind, folks, that a lot of these situations have occurred over the years in various cultures and all that. There's a little bit of a downside in that, you know, people can just hop onto Reddit, come up with a fake account, and it, you know, will be somewhat immortalized there. Potentially some of the ones that we've read today are, you know, such things. But Tyler himself has had experiences. We've had listeners write in and tell us about their experiences. And honestly, in a way, I kind of think that platforms such as, whatever, online, we'll just say, I'm not even going to brand it out there, online platforms where people can sort of share these accounts in an anonymous way, kind of give the freedom to these people who have been kind of scared to talk about it.
Yeah.
And they don't feel like alone. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. And also, like, even when you just read the story from Sarah that was like so similar to mine, I mean, I'm sure you could hear it, like the excitement in my voice, because I don't know, it does, like, obviously with the Shadow Man and the Hat Man and stuff, there are so many. I mean, it's like the number one, the percentage of you having like an encounter with one of these characters is like by far higher than any other sort of paranormal events you can have. It's just like so many people have had this exact same account. And so when I just heard, like, those like little details that, for the longest time I felt like was only me that had sort of experienced a lot of that stuff. I don't know, it does give you an assurance, and it does kind of make you feel better, because it's like, oh, well, they're also seeing this other thing. They're also seeing it shift its weight, and, these different kind of like, like little details that, I don't know, can be so beneficial to someone who feels like isolated and alone in these like, pretty terrifying scenarios.
For sure, man. I mean, what a time to not want to be isolated when you're completely terrified of something that can just be a shadow inside of your room. You want to be able to talk this out with somebody, relate to others. I mean, after all, that's kind of like, I don't know. I guess that's probably why we all listen to podcasts and stuff, is to be like, oh, yeah. I know that. I can relate to that, right?
Yeah.
I think it's about time for us to start talking about what we think is going on here, and potentially all the different various ideas about it. I mean, we've said, hey, is this a demon? Is it a time traveler? Is it a, interdimensional being or person that's sort of stranded? Is it someone is there some sort of way that, people can come and visit our time, whether that's from another dimension or from the afterlife?
Yeah, so I've thought about this a lot, and for the longest time, I would say I had this sort of opinion on this, and it's weird because the only way that I was able to have this opinion is by kind of taking my particular encounter like out of the equation. But for the longest time, I did think that, well, maybe it is like a dimensional thing. Maybe it is that idea that, like, we're three-dimensional in our plane of existence, and so when we see a shadow, it's two-dimensional. And so maybe it is that more advanced, like, weird way of looking at it, where, okay, well, maybe in the fourth dimension, which again, a lot of people believe that that's time itself, maybe their shadows are actually three-dimensional. And so that's kind of what we're seeing. And I think that is really interesting, and it is that sort of interdimensionality component where, they're just sort of like observing, and they just kind of stand at the end of your bed, or they stand off in the corner. But I don't know, I feel like you bring the Hat Man into it, and it just turns into a totally different thing.
Yeah. And it's just very hard for me not to just think that it's, some sort of visit of some kind. And the fact that, like, in some ways people have a similar experience and it's not as intense, of like makes me think that, they're just being visited by different people, or it kind of reminds me in a way of that movie. Was it Premonition? Am I thinking the right one?
The time travel one?
Yeah.
Oh, God, so good.
Okay, so like maybe there's really just one or two people that are capable of doing this, or maybe even a small organization. And within that small organization, there's somebody that's bad, nefarious. They're just a jerk, We all know that those kind of people exist, right?
Yeah.
And that person is kind of messing with people throughout time. And the reason why all of these stories and sightings and stuff have this connectivity is because, you know, maybe it starts with somebody doing it and observing, and they're the nice person. And then within that same time table or period, this, you know, a-hole comes in and is messing with people. I don't know, man. It's just, is it also, I can't help but also think about what we talk about often as well, is like the concept of, you know, a tulpa. And because now we have this ability to communicate so quickly and to distribute information so quickly and vastly, that reach is so huge, you know, maybe that collective belief and intense concentration on these, you know, entities gives it more power and spreads it to more people. And, you know, maybe we're doing humanity a disservice in a way by continuing to talk about this stuff and talk about it. And I said talk about it twice in a row there.
Well, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because here's something about this whole phenomenon that I've never heard about. And so this was like a really exciting moment for me. But apparently this has become a thing called the Benadryl Hat Man. I'd never heard of this up until now. I don't have TikTok. I don't have Facebook. I have Instagram, but you know, it's for art and stuff. But yeah, this is from drugs.com, which is, you know, an aggregate website that just, you know, gives you information on any sort of pharmaceutical drugs. And it literally, this made the rounds so much that it actually is featured on the site. And it says here, the Hat Man is a fictional figure that started appearing on certain internet sites in the early 2000s that has recently been referred to as the Benadryl Hat Man. After reports of people hallucinating and sighting him after overconsumption or abuse of Benadryl. Most of these reports have appeared on Reddit or the image-based bulletin site 4chan and 8chan. The Hat Man has also been associated with abuse of any mind-altering substance taken to excess, and there's a mini documentary about him being associated with sleep paralysis on YouTube. You know, and then it goes on to talk about, you know, high doses of Benadryl can lead to heart problems, delirium, psychosis, seizures, coma, etc. I thought that was fascinating. And the first thing that I thought of when I found out about this is that weird kind of thing that we see when people do ayahuasca or, you know, certain psychedelics. You know, they talk about like the machine elves, like, you know, Joe Rogan's like a big proponent of this. Probably the most popular person who's ever talked about this is they talk about, you know, they have these sort of psychedelic trips and they're seeing, you know, these things that they're called machine elves, and they're these sort of like, you know, weird sort of jester looking characters. Think the Harlequin, which is my favorite and least favorite. And every single person that does this, if they have like a trip where they're seeing like any sort of entities, they're all sharing the exact same thing. They're seeing these machine elves who have checkerboard pattern clothes. They usually have jester hats and, you know, really bizarre like hexagon like shapes all over the place. So what is it that is causing that? And then furthermore, what is it about like Benadryl causing people to see the same Hat Man?
Man, it's so
it's
weird.
fascinating.
I mean, it's crazy because like at first, you know, when you listen to the description of like something like drugs.com, I mean, my teenager brain is just like, you know, just wants to start laughing because it sounds like something bad. But just in case you're not familiar with the site, listeners, you know, it's like Tyler said, it's an aggregate that sort of pulls in different, most importantly, I think, is just like drug interactions, side effects, things that occur whenever you know, take too much and everything. And so the fact that the Hat Man has appeared on this is I mean, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah. I mean, especially even on drugfree.org, there's a breakdown of this that says, what is the Benadryl challenge? And so this is the aspect of it that made it onto like TikTok, where basically, these kids are taking, a minimum of 12 Benadryl tablets, and they're trying to like induce hallucinations where every single one of these, they're seeing the Hat Man.
I mean, I got to go ahead and say a disclaimer here. Do not do that. Because, of course, you obviously will risk death. Very bad health problems, and or some sort of mental break potentially.
Yeah.
So, I mean.
We're not advocating that at all. But there is something really interesting about it.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about it is the fact that, like, there's this intersection of sort of what some potentially would consider almost like a, what's it called? Like a fiction stuff, the something spaghetti, or what is it called? Creepypasta.
Yeah.
Never sounded like more of an old man than something spaghetti.
Yeah.
So anyways, there's this intersection of something spaghetti and real life science, or at least real life occurrences that spawn this like stupid idiot trend challenge crap. And just like you said, man, relating it to like the ayahuasca stuff, why are people seeing the same thing? That's the question here. Like, how are all these people from different cultures, different times, different areas seeing the same thing? The super skeptic will say, well, we're just seeing, a more, it's more prominent now because collectively we've talked about it more. People are more aware of it. So people are telling more stories of it in a similar fashion. A lot of those that same line of thinking, people would use that argument potentially for like, when there's a flap, a UFO flap, a Mothman type flap, any kind of flap. People will say, well, everyone described the same shaped UFO because everyone was talking about it. And then, oh, yeah, I saw it too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, of course, those arguments exist. But within all of that, it's just, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, I just hope I never experience it. If that's the biggest thing.
Well, my thoughts on this, and I mean, I guess this is the part of the show where we kind of get into like the breakdown, but my thoughts are, similar to like the ayahuasca ceremonies or like the DMT stuff. I feel like maybe, what's the best way to explain this? Like, I think maybe there's some sort of aspect of the sort of ingredients in that, or some sort of component that is maybe like either filtering out the spectrum of what we're like allowed to see. Maybe it's like, maybe there's something there that's allowing us to like see beyond like this sort of veil, or beyond like the, if you want to get into like simulation theory, it's just like giving you an extra like little bump in like frequency range. So you're suddenly now able to see, a few percentages more on like, which is otherwise like we're unable to see or hear or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of like opening up that previously locked door.
Right.
Somehow a substance, which again, like what do these substances do? Well, they alter your mental state, or they infuse your body with like a chemical that changes certain things. And it's, when that happens, then that begs the question that like, in so many ways, our minds are not only connected to each other, but also connected to whatever else exists beyond our life right now here on Earth.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think in the ingredients of Benadryl, or like taking too much of that, I think, I mean, this is pretty creepy, but I get the idea that, basically, like me seeing the shadow person and all these other sort of accounts of people seeing Hat Man and Shadow Man and stuff, I think these things are probably around a lot more. And so taking like that much Benadryl, whatever's in that sort of, combination of ingredients, it's just sort of opening that window so you're able to see them now.
And then,
and maybe even it's like sort of calling out to that too.
man, and then
It's like-
opening this door that,
Right.
just like we talk about with ancient artifacts or even things like Ouija boards or whatever it is, you're opening this door that you might not be able to close, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard often that, people that do like these, like especially like with psychedelics and stuff, a lot of time these, like psychonauts, they call themselves, but like, with like mushrooms and that whole sort of 60s psychedelia kind of stuff, a lot of these people that do or have done this on a somewhat regular basis, they do talk about like being able to see these crazy like hallucinations, mentioned before with ayahuasca and or anything associated with like DMT, with like the clockwork or the machine elves. A lot of these people do mention that like once they view these things for the first time, it is almost like it's almost like them shooting like a flare up into the sky in like in another dimension or something. So now like whatever beings are on that other side, they now know, oh, this person can see us. And then that's when they start having like a lot of other encounters. And I mean, to me, that's terrifying.
Right.
Because you're really putting yourself in a, pretty vulnerable position, I would say.
Oh, for sure, man. Now, let me ask you this before we wrap it up. Do you think, and you can give me a short answer, but a truthful one, do you think the Hat Man, is there any connection between the Hat Man and Men in Black?
I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm sure you already knew that it was not going to be a short answer. So I've heard this for years where people try to make the connection. So there's an author by the name of Nick Redfern who I'm a huge fan of his work. I would love to eventually have him on. He is one of the most prolific writers probably of all time, especially in this field. I mean, he puts out like 5 books a year kind of thing. Like he's amazing. And you can find a ton of podcast interviews. He's been on like every, good paranormal podcast, but he's talked about that a lot before. And this idea that like, and also David Weatherly with the black-eyed kid phenomenon, which we'll definitely do a show about that because it's fascinating. But it is that idea that there's that sort of phantom stranger concept, or like what he said, like the man in black, or like, that sort of ancient idea that this character would show up and he was all dressed in black and, he was actually like the devil or something. I do think there could be something tied with like the Men in Black stuff. I just don't really know what it is though.
Right.
I don't really know what that connective tissue is. But the reason I say that is because, now I just learned that like the fedora was actually created in like the 1890s. So it does sort of extend that window of how long these things have been around. But I guess my question is why, like, why are we seeing the Hat Man, and did the fedora just sort of appear at the inception of the fedora in the real world in the 1890s, or was that something that was already happening long before the actual hat was made?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. Because for me, when I think of like Men in Black, obviously you think of like, men in suits from like the 40s and 50s. And there's so many like really like truly bizarre stuff with Men in Black. Like they'll have like almost robotic behavior. They won't know how to do things that are fairly common, like eating Jell-O, or they don't understand, like they won't have any like lips on their mouth, or they'll have like lipstick to give themselves like color on the, like just really bizarre, sort of otherworldly things. And to me, that's the aspect of the Men in Black that I feel like could have a connection to the Hat Men, especially in the sense that, you know, a lot of times, especially in the 40s and 50s and 60s, you would have, you know, people would have these, you know, they would see a UFO, or they would take a picture of a UFO, and then they would be visited by these Men in Black characters. And a lot of them, like I said, they wouldn't know how to act. Like it's like they were visitors from somewhere. And so to me, the idea that, especially with the Shadow Men, probably more so than the Hat Man encounters, that idea that they're just sort of standing in the corner, just like watching somebody sleep. Like to me, that does kind of line up. However, I don't quite know how or where the two intersect, you know?
Well, maybe as we explore all of these concepts, maybe we'll uncover that.
Absolutely, dude. If you would like to find us on the internet, head on over to our Instagram. That would be Rad Podcast. Jump in the comment section. We'd love to hear from you. If you would like to tell us about your own experience, shoot us a DM. If it's more long form, head on over to thatwouldberadpodcast@gmail.com. Even better than all those things would be head on over to our website, thatwouldberadpodcast.com, where you can leave a voice memo of your own encounter, and you may hear that in an upcoming episode. Any or everything that you have to say that's just like kind of weird, or maybe even if you remember some obscure movie from the 80s that we've never heard of, or there's this bizarre sort of local urban legend that is only sort of local to your area. Those are the things that we live off of, and we love any and all of that stuff. So if you want to send in that stuff or tell your own story, we would love to have you. And it may be featured in a future episode. If you really want to support the show, head on over to our Patreon, The Rabbit Trail, where it's kind of just more of what you love. It's a little loosier, a little goosier. And we record it a little later at night typically. So, you know, just let the rambling, you know, there's more rambling if you didn't think that was possible, especially for me. Buy us a coffee. We do have some merch coming up that we're excited to talk about. Tell that weird friend of yours about the show. I'm sure they would love it. And if you have the time, and this is extremely helpful to us, you know, ticking that algorithm, give us a 5-star review on whatever podcast or podcatcher that you listen to us on. It just helps us get in front of more ears, and we really appreciate it. What do you got? Anything else?
I think that's it, man.
All right. Well, we love you. We appreciate you. And as always,
Be rad.
That's the way it goes. You're my favorite song on the radio. time where I just needed some sunshine. You were already dead, for you became a ghost. You always said our future would be a parade of